You might remember this man, Mike Pence, who was the Vice President of the United States from 2016 through to 2020. He was President Trump's right-hand man and able to provide a stabilizing force in the government, particularly during the COVID response. He also oversaw the 2020 election results and conceded to the Democrat Party that Joe Biden had won. This infuriated Trump, and the relationship between them quickly deteriorated. After the January 6th attack on the Capitol, this was the severing of their relationship. Trump branded Pence a traitor, and Pence retaliated with the idea that Trump was off the rails. The next 4 years, Trump was adamant that the election was stolen, that he was wrongfully kept from the Oval Office, and made a commanding bid for the 2024 election. The result is a much more loyalistic approach to government, with Trump requiring those who are closest to him to pledge a great deal of allegiance. A very similar thing happened to Joseph Smith. This man is Oliver Cowdery, and he was Joseph's right-hand man in Ohio. The two fell out when Joseph took his teenage housekeeper, Fanny Alger, as a sexual relationship. And when things deteriorated in Kirtland over the bank scandal, Oliver and Joseph completely split. Joseph accused Oliver of counterfeiting and from spreading false rumors, and he excommunicated him from the church. Joseph, now in Missouri, required strong loyalty to the first presidency and the idea that people needed to support them whether they were right or wrong. This led to the formation of the Danites, a henchman group that enforced loyalty to Joseph and Sidney. This meant the church in Missouri and also into Illinois had no checks and balances. What Joseph said went, regardless of what it was. And Joseph became more and more extreme. Oliver Cowdery had been a calming influence on Joseph and the church, making sure that the equality and also the responsibilities of leadership were always taken care of. Without that, the church quickly deteriorated. Mike Pence was also that kind of person who kept Trump's extremes in check, and without him or somebody like him in the cabinet, this particular presidency is on some pretty tragic trajectories. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she is a congresswoman from Georgia who has been in the news recently because she flipped on the Republican Party with regard to Trump. This is met with a severe and immediate backlash from the president in a number of tweets calling her a traitor. And because of increasing death threats, which she ascribes to the attitude of the president against her, she has decided to resign. She is a good example of how things can get so extreme within these kind of political groups that then the stakes become so large that people within it are at the point of causing violence. After Oliver Cowdery and many of the Whitmers were excommunicated from the church in early 1838 in Missouri, this was a real problem for the fledgling church trying to build its base in Far West. These men were critical of the church and church leadership, and sermons started to be preached against them. In June 17th of 1838, Sidney Rigdon preached a sermon against these dissenters, suggesting that they were like the New Testament salt that has lost its savour. Joseph Smith relates in his journal, President Rigdon preached one Sabbath upon the salt that has lost its savour, and that it is henceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men. And the wicked flee when no man pursueth. These men took warning, and soon they were seen bounding over the prairie like the scapegoat to carry off their own sins. We have not seen them since. Their influence is gone. What Joseph is referring to is the establishment of the Danites, these henchmen that will support the leaders of the church whether they do anything right or wrong. They wrote a letter to Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmers, warning them that if they stayed, their lives would be in danger. Joseph further wrote in his journal, "Some time past the brethren or saints have come up day after day to consecrate and bring their offerings into the storehouse of the Lord, to prove him now herewith, and see if he will not pour out a blessing, that there will not be room enough to contain it. They have come up hither thus far according to the revelation order of the Danites. We have a company of Danites in these times to put right physically that which is not right, and to cleanse the church of very great evils which have hitherto existed among us, insomuch as they cannot be put to right by teachings and persuasions. This company, or part of them, exhibited on the 4th of July. They came up to consecrate by their companies of tens, commanded by their captain over 10. This group was set up as a paramilitary group to be the enforcers in regard to the presidency of the church. It was later reported in testimony that some individuals went so far as to state that they would kill any person if the presidency would say it was the will of God. One of the great things about the Danites was that Joseph was able to kind of outsource the violence that he needed to enable to enforce his will. And then later, if he was held to account on this, he could deny it because he wasn't physically involved. And this is exactly what happened at his trial, was he threw Samson Avad, who was the head of the Danites, under the bus, saying that he never authorized him and that Samson had gone off on some tangent and that Joseph was never involved in any of this violence. Trump does exactly the same kind of thing. He brandishes people traitors, suggests that they get the death penalty, and this becomes dog whistles to those people who are willing to follow his lead, even though he hasn't given them a specific assignment. So we have the case with Marjorie Taylor Greene, that she's fleeing Congress, just like some of these early dissenters are fleeing Far West. And of course, this then becomes a cautionary tale to anybody who might even be contemplating breaking with their loyalty because they're concerned about what's happening. On the 6th of January 2021, rioters attacked the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They were inflamed over accusations that Trump had made that the election had been stolen by the Democrats. They broke into the building, they caused a lot of damage. 5 people eventually died relating to the incident, and also $2.7 million worth of damage. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people entered the complex, vandalized and looted various offices. Hundreds were injured. 174 police officers sustained injuries that day. Trump was impeached for the insurrection, but the Senate failed to give the 2/3 majority needed to give him a conviction. A similar battle and insurrection happened with Joseph Smith. On October the 18th, 1838, tensions had reached a boiling point in Far West Missouri. Fearing that they were going to be ousted, Joseph Smith preached a sermon related to the idea of David and the showbread, and also Christ with his disciples eating the corn. Basically, he was telling the Danites that the people of Missouri were now enemies, and they were allowed to then take from their neighbors. He put it in such coded language that they understood that they had his approval, but he didn't actually say it. Nearby towns of Gallatin and Millport were attacked by Danite forces. They drove off the inhabitants, they looted their goods, and they burned down buildings. The spoils were taken back to Far West to put into the bishop's storehouse. The governor, Lilburn Bodds, sent the state militia to quell the violence, and they had been settled at a site in Broken River. The Mormon militia, including the paramilitary Danites, attacked the forces. This was led by one of the senior apostles, David Patton, who was also a Danite, and this became known as the Battle of Crooked River. 4 people died, including 3 Mormons and 1 of the other forces. General David Patton was one of those who was killed and held up as a martyr. Violence escalated, and eventually Joseph was arrested for treason. It was a huge mess with a lot of wrong committed on both sides. Joseph was held in Liberty Jail with a number of top leaders. They did a preliminary hearing, and you can go read the transcripts of all of these events and the testimonies of members and non-members about these occurrences. There were wrongs committed on all sides, and it became a bit of an embarrassment to the Missouri government. When Joseph and his companions escaped, Missouri did not pursue them into Illinois at that stage for extradition. So Joseph kind of got away with inciting this insurrection, just like Trump got away with inciting his insurrection. Joseph was held up as a hero when he managed to get to Quincy, Illinois. And Trump was able to campaign again for the US presidency and win in 2024. Both men seem to come out vindicated and able to lead further. On January 17th, 2025, just days before his inauguration, Trump declared that he was issuing a cryptocurrency, Trump coin. This was hugely controversial for a number of reasons, one of them being that cryptocurrency was hard to track, and the idea that money could come in and out of that account without any kind of oversight was a real problem. But also that the president and his family might be enriched by their political position. And an endeavor like this could mean lots of little people putting in their life savings at something that is quite volatile and prone to speculation and disaster. The cryptocurrency exploded with anticipation in those first few days and has dragged down ever since. But it's certain that a number of people made a lot of money, and that some money changed hands with regard to the idea that it could provide political favours. But supporters, even little investors, were hopeful that a new president with a new idea about currency might provide some answers to some of the world's big economic problems. Something similar happened to Joseph Smith in 1836. After a failed treasure dig to Massachusetts, Joseph, Oliver, Sidney, and also Hiram decided on creating a bank that might provide liquidity to Kirtland, Ohio. Joseph sent Oliver to Philadelphia to get printing plates, and the Kirtland Safety Society Bank was born with the idea that they could print money. When they failed to get a charter from Ohio, they just printed anti-banking company on the notes so that they could suggest that they were outside the banking industry and therefore not subject to the regulation that was sparse if best at the time. Warren Parrish, who is the cashier, talked about this situation. I've been astonished to hear Joseph declare that we had $60,000 in specie in our vaults and $600,000 at our command when we had not to exceed $6,000 and could not command any more. Also that we had about $10,000 of our bills in circulation when he, as cashier of the institution, knew that there was at least $150,000. The banknotes that Joseph Smith produced flooded the market, allowed for huge speculation on land and a lot of transfer of wealth. But by early 1837, the bank started to have increasing problems, particularly as the wider region had problems with their banking industry too. Local people, including Grandison New, were suspicious of this activity and did not believe that Joseph had the funds backing these notes. He collected as many as he could and then made a run on the bank, which subsequently fell over quite spectacularly. Hundreds of members of the church, particularly senior members of the church who had sunk their life savings into this endeavor, lost everything. The fallout caused a major schism, particularly with the top leadership in the Quorum of the 12. They'd been assured by revelation by Joseph that this bank would win when all other banks would fail. Joseph and Sydney had to flee Kirtland in early 1836 for their lives because things had become so bad. The lawsuits and the accusations and also the threats to them personally meant that they had to leave, and they escaped to far west. It effectively meant the disintegration of the Kirtland church. Joseph's desire to be rich and to speculate caused a huge downfall in Ohio. Trump's speculation in a similar way seems to have the hallmarks of the same kind of pitfalls. One of the challenges of authoritarian leadership is the lack of consistency, sometimes the contradictions, and certainly the hypocrisy. The idea that powerful, wealthy individuals get different treatment than those who are just normal, everyday citizens. This kind of thing has plagued the Trump administration because there seems to be some people who can circumvent normal checks and balances and the law. This certainly has been the case with a lot of President Trump's pardons, where he pardons people for the very things that he says that he is fighting against. This creates a lot of confusion, but it also undermines the ideas that there's some things which are consistent and reliable. This was a major criticism of Joseph, particularly in Nauvoo, because the people who were closest to him got favours which weren't available to the everyday person. Joseph set up a quorum of the anointed, the idea that these select individuals, an elite class in Nauvoo, would have power to do whatever they wanted and would have no repercussions as long as they were approved by Joseph. He even taught such in some of his letters. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and is often right under another. The idea that whatsoever God requires is right no matter what it is. This meant that multiple sexual relationships could be authorized by Joseph and were so to the exclusion of some of the members. And then in public, he would suggest that this was totally against the law of God, but in private, he would selectively allow for certain people to participate. This meant that lots of people were vying for his favors and would allow him to do anything that he wanted to do, as long as he then approved of them doing certain things too. Even laws that could get you to heaven could be worked around with the idea that as long as somebody doesn't accuse him and he doesn't accuse them, that they can go into heaven together. Now, this was great if you were one of these inner circle that got these special favors, and often you would sacrifice a great deal to be one of those people. But if you weren't in that inner circle, or you found some of the actions questionable, then things started to deteriorate quite quickly. This certainly was the case with Joseph's second counselor in the first presidency, William Law, who started to see what Joseph was doing and alienating certain people, but also propping up some things exclusively for himself and for those who supported him, became alarmed. He sought to correct Joseph in private, and he made bids to suggest that the ways in which Joseph was leading in Nauvoo were going to cause a number of problems for the church, and particularly for Joseph himself. When these warnings weren't heeded, William Law went to the legal system to get some kind of relief. Joseph slandered William Law, excommunicated him from the church, and wouldn't allow him to put forward these ideas that the extremes in Nauvoo were going to cause this kind of downfall. This led to the Nauvoo Expositor paper being published and Joseph squashing the free press in Nauvoo, which led to riot, which led to his arrest on treason charges. Inequality breeds a huge amount of contempt, and that is what happened in Nauvoo to Joseph. Those kinds of contradictions and hypocrisy are also the breeding ground of contempt in the United States today with the Trump administration. One of the trickiest things to unravel for accusations is the idea of obstruction and intimidation. It can be really hard to tell who is telling the truth, and are there some bad actors that are playing out in some really terrible ways. If you're an authoritarian leader, what is happening in public is different to what is happening in private. And it may be sometime later, when people are whistleblowers, that you get to understand what's going on behind the scenes in regards to particular situations. In the moment, though, it can just look like somebody who is being attacked, attacking back, or defending themselves. President Trump is really good at this particular tactic. The idea that somebody is attacking him and he's just righting the wrongs, and therefore what looks like a bad soundbite is just really a valid reaction to some pretty terrible accusations. To those who are not supportive, it may look like obstruction and maybe even intimidation. So what can be happening behind the scenes? Joseph Smith realized pretty early on that he could reuse revelations to suggest that some people were in the wrong and could not be trusted. He was also quite a big man, and he gave a number of thrashings to some people, even key members of his family, when he was upset with them. He then also used the High Council to threaten and censure people. This increased throughout his leadership in the church, and by 1837, Grandison Newell, who had made lots of complaints against Joseph Smith and who also instigated a run on the banks, Joseph Smith organized an intimidation of him. He suggested that Grandison Newell should be put out of the way, or where the crows can't find him. And Grandison Newell complained to the courts that Joseph Smith was trying to kill him. In Missouri, Joseph used the Danites to intimidate the dissenters to leave town, and also to surround the property of Justice Black to get him to sign an affidavit that he was not going to come against the Mormons. Joseph also used the Danites in Missouri to enforce the idea that people needed to fight for the church, even if they believed that those things were suspect. And after a fallout with William Law and William Marks in Nauvoo around political support, he organized the secret police in the town to intimidate the two men, suggesting that they were doughheads and needed to be taken care of. This was brought before the Nauvoo High Council, and testimony was given that some of the police had been given orders that were outside of their legal responsibilities. Several men in Nauvoo were warned out, suggesting that things might come to a head if they did not leave peacefully. Joseph also used the Relief Society against women who had been propositioned and rejected Joseph in plural sexual relationships. He published slander in the paper against them, brandishing them as whores and harlots. When these acts of intimidation were not checked, these things just got worse and worse, and Joseph was emboldened, and even those people who were supporting him felt more and more entitled to do these kinds of things on his behalf. One of the great tragedies of 1844 was Joseph and Hiram's death at the hands of an angry mob, but a lot of this was because they just did not think that he would be able to face justice, because he was able to get out of so many things through the use of such things as intimidation. Many are worried about the same kind of thing with Trump, that he's done so many terrible things that he will not leave office without a great fight. And while in office, he will use every measure he possibly can to intimidate, to threaten, and silence any opponents. In June and October of this year were No Kings protests, suggesting that Donald Trump, as President of the United States, was sliding into authoritarian and tyrannical leadership. The first protest garnered over 4 million people, and the second over 7 million people. The dramatic changes in the US just in this year alone have made people incredibly scared that the US is losing its democracy. That Donald J. Trump is setting up a legacy for the idea that a dictatorship would be better for the republic. He has challenged a number of constitutional edicts, and he has disabled many of the separation of powers that have tried to keep the US as a democracy. Joseph Smith did an incredibly similar thing. The Book of Mormon itself, published in 1830, talked against kings. It had the same kind of mandate that the early United States did with regard to the idea that kings were a problem, that a system of democracy in a voting republic would allow for people to make sure that their freedoms were kept. This was supported by a number of early church revelations which supported the Constitution and the idea that kings were not a great solution for free-loving people. The only king that would be allowed is Jesus Christ, and he would be a king that would rule later after his second coming. But Joseph became increasingly authoritarian as the church went on. The checks and balances and the equality that were part of the early church and its democracy, even in its voting, were slowly eroded as Joseph faced more threats. By the mid-1840s, Joseph was head of a city-state. Nauvoo, as a city, operated like a little kingdom. Joseph was the mayor, he was the Chief Justice, he was the prophet, he was the military head, he was everything, and he controlled everything. This was evident to the populace around him. Early, even in Kirtland, he was accused of forming some kind of monarchy, but he was able to dispel this rumor. But by Nauvoo, people could see it clear that Joseph was setting up the city-state with him as the head. Joseph even said in 1843, "All our wrongs have arisen under the power and authority of democracy." Joseph sought to run for the President of the United States, and he organized a council of 50 men to support him in that endeavor. On the 11th of April 1844, these men crowned Joseph king. The minutes state, he concluded by offering a motion that this honourable assembly receive from this time henceforth and forever Joseph Smith as our prophet, priest, and king, and uphold him in that capacity in which God has anointed him. The motion was seconded and accepted unanimously. All seemed agreed to look to some place where they can go and establish a theocracy, either in Texas or Oregon or in somewhere in California. The brethren spoke very warmly on the subject, and also on the subject of forming a constitution which shall be according to the mind of God and erect it between the heavens and the earth, where all nations might flow unto it. Despite these meetings being a secret, this understanding was leaked out to the press. The Missouri Republican reported Joseph Smith is not only prophet, but also Mormon king. Governor Thomas Ford learned Joseph caused himself to be crowned and anointed king and priest, far above the rest, openly denouncing the government of the United States as utterly corrupt and as being about to pass away. This was a complete reversal of the Book of Mormon, but also Joseph's new reality. He was king. And this theocracy was meant to continue. After Joseph was killed later that year in 1844, Brigham Young was crowned king by the Council of 50. And after Brigham Young died, John Taylor was crowned king on the 4th of February 1885. This was not continued by Wilford Woodruff, who in 1890 acquiesced to the United States government on polygamy and entered statehood in 1896. Being king was one of the accusations in the Nauvoo Expositor that got Joseph killed. They stated, "We will not acknowledge any man as king or lawgiver to the church, for Christ is our only king and lawgiver." Joseph was killed for setting himself up as a king in a democracy. The idea that the current president of the United States is inching towards kingship as a reality is frightening. One of the strange little coincidences between Donald Trump and Joseph Smith is the age of difference with their wives. This is Melania Trump. She was born in April of 1970, which makes her 55 years old right now. Donald Trump was born in June of 1846, and so they are 23 years apart. President Trump could easily be Melania's father. In fact, her own father is only 2 years older than Donald. They met in 1998 when she was 28 years old and modelling, and like his previous wives, who all seemed to be models as well, they began having a relationship quite quickly. They got married in 2005 and had a child soon after. This is Helen Mar Kimball, and she was born in August of 1828. She was married to Joseph Smith in May of 1843. And since Joseph was born in December of 1805, he was 23 years older than Helen Mar when he was 37 and she was 14. Like Donald Trump, Joseph Smith was old enough to be Helen's father. These massive differences in age, generational differences, are really problematic for a number of reasons. In the case of Melania, she's 28 years old when she meets Donald, and they're quite different in their social space. He is a person of great influence. He exerts that over her. She's no dummy, of course, and she ends up being in a long-term relationship. With Helen Mar, there is an extreme power differential and also a difficult age gap, particularly at 14, where you are really in subjection to your parents, which is how Helen managed to be married to Joseph in the first place, was that she was given to him by her father. The idea of powerful men having trophy wives young enough to be their daughters is really problematic. It suggests a measure of ego and accessibility rather than consent. Joseph Smith was killed a year after his marriage with Helen Mar, and so she never had any children with him. She went on to marry a Whitney, who was a brother of another plural wife of Joseph, and ended up having 11 children and living quite a long life. Melania, for her part, has stood by her husband during a number of presidential elections and also as President of the United States twice, and seems to have a good handle on what is going on and her place and her opportunities in that. But it is just curious that these two powerful authoritarian figures end up with these very young wives. One of the most concerning things about the Trump presidency is the cult of personality that is attached to it, the identity that other people give themselves in relation to the President of the United States. The idea of MAGA, or Make America Great Again, is this catchphrase and also this identity is a really interesting phenomena, but it means that people buy into a whole raft of different things with regard to President Trump. There are fashion markers like the red cap with the white writing. There are flags, with the American flag being utilized in relation to Trump. There is a definite conflation with Jesus and Christianity, and the idea that Trump is close to or identifies with or represents Jesus in a very literal sense. And there is a real mobilization of this identity, not just to the polls, but also protesting and perhaps even pushing against the government. This identity can be so strong amongst people that they are not willing to see any problems with Trump or even to check and balance some of his proposals or his predictions or his actions, and that any idea that Trump may be in any way dishonest or a problem is met with fierce opposition, maybe even a severing of a relationship. This is both endearing because you have such great trust in this person, but also a real problem if that trust is being utilized for nefarious means. This same kind of thing happened with Joseph Smith. Once people followed him and sacrificed a great deal to be with him and defend him, suddenly their identity was wrapped up in his morality and his righteousness, such that nobody could hear anything that was a problem to the wider public. This developed to the idea of Danites, the idea that people would defend the first presidency of the church, including Joseph Smith, whether he did wrong or right, that anything he did was what the Lord wanted, therefore they would defend him even to violence. This continues in the church today, that there's a real identity that happens with Mormons, the idea that they are in this thing and they will defend, regardless of what the accusations are, whatever the church, its prophets, and maybe even Joseph Smith have or will do. This has meant that in some cases with breakoffs like the FLDS, there is a real allegiance to the prophet and the ability for this person to direct and terrorize people because he has so much power, so much identity wrapped up in him and his followers that defend him no matter what. It also means some oddity with regard to dress. There's a definite identity that comes along with how you dress and in what setting, so that people can understand that you believe, that you are invested in this particular identity, and that you will follow through with certain actions. And again, this can mean that any criticism or bringing up of tough things can sever relationships and families that want to preserve this identity above all other aspects. So in the same way that MAGA identity might take over a person's life, their understanding of the world, their politics, their allegiances, and their willingness to act in a particular way, this is the same thing that happens with the church. And it's certainly something that happened with Joseph and his followers. Loyalty to a particular identity to the point of persecution builds this idea that something is righteous, that suffering in the name of, or not criticizing or not looking too closely or showing faith through figuring out loyalty or obedience over transparency is a really interesting hallmark of authoritarian leaders and what they require of their followers. And in return, you get community, you get certainty, and you get some form of superiority. And that is the magic of identity. There are a number of disheartening things that Trump has done to suggest that he believes in white supremacy. And this also seems to be a sentiment that he's connecting with regard to his base. The idea that America has changed, particularly in the last 50 years, with more immigrants that come from places that are brown, suggests that America's predominance and privilege for white people has been eroding. And this has culminated with a number of edicts that suggest that Trump is really calling dog whistles to those kinds of people who think that America is changing in ways that they are not comfortable with. This means that people are willing to look the other way on things that they are particularly concerned about, because some of the things that they are very concerned about are being addressed. The United States has had a fraught relationship with its indigenous people and then with slavery, which has meant that brown and black people particularly have been on the most marginalized of populations, but also have been pitted against as privilege has allowed European white settlers to take over. Joseph Smith captured this in the Book of Mormon with the idea that the Native Americans were fallen Israelites who had then been cursed by God for the availability of the white Gentile settlers to take over. This meant that particularly Native Americans needed significant Christian reform, and when they did not participate in that, particularly from a Mormon standpoint, they became unredeemable and therefore expendable. Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 effectively enacted apartheid in the United States, putting the Native Americans on a line outside of the United States. This solved many of the threat narratives that were underpinning the Book of Mormon and the kinds of concerns that Western white settlers had over the Americas. As Mormons, who were predominantly Northerners, started to flow into Missouri, which was a slave state, this caused tensions between the members and the local Missourians. By 1836, Joseph started appeasing local Missourians around these kind of slave issues, including suggesting that slavery was something that God approved of. His further scriptures, like the Book of Abraham, suggested that black people were cursed to not have the priesthood. This also meant the curse of Cain related to black people meant that they should be separate from white people, and Joseph advocated for apartheid for black people in relation to slavery. That they should be free, yes, but they should be distinct and separate from white society. Joseph did have some equivocation. He did ordain some black men to the priesthood, and he did welcome some black people into Nauvoo. But his overwhelming narrative was that black people were less than. And this continued in the church, particularly when Brigham Young took a number of saints to Utah. Joseph might not have been particularly racist himself, but he did conform to the current understandings of his day. And he did make them worse by enshrining them in Scripture. It also became a big part of LDS theology. Orson Hyde, who was an apostle in 1845, spoke this: I told them that in the accounts of heaven, when Satan rebelled, there were some who took an active part in the rebellion, but yet were too cowardly to be the leaders of this rebellion with Lucifer and others. The leaders in this rebellion were hurried from heaven to hell and were doomed to remain without bodies, but the others whose crime were not so great were cursed with blackness and became black spirits. When Cain murdered his brother Abel on the earth, the Almighty cursed him and put a mark on him, or rather turned him black, to give the black spirits a chance to come and take bodies like themselves, and the black spirits taking the black bodies made the Negroes. This has fostered a huge white supremacy narrative in the church. And it's a white supremacy narrative which is a part of US politics today. A narrative that people like President Trump are using to galvanize his support, and some of the support comes from Mormons who have invested in this white supremacy that has come particularly from Joseph Smith.